So the media is still not very diverse. Now, hold on to your horses. I know what you're thinking. Like, the media is very diverse. We try to make a big effort. And I will grant you, the media has made a leaps and bounds in diversifying the people that work in capital M media. But I think we need to have a little more nuanced discussion about diversity in media. So the main term diversity, when people think diversity, is of course like diversity of background, in the sense of like people of color, Asians, women, and digital media companies have done really well in diversifying their workforce in terms of like having women, having people of color, having Asians, having Native Americans. And I think that's done, one, just as it should be done, is just kind of the moral high ground, but two, to have a diversity of opinions. But I think there's still a disconnect. Just because you diversify your workforce in ethnic background or cultural background doesn't mean you actually have a diverse workforce, at least in terms of having a broad market appeal to a diverse country like the United States. So I'm going to use a bit of my history background. I was trained as a historian, and there are 6 types of historians. There's a cultural historian, social historian, economic historian, political historian, that's number 4, diplomatic historian, intellectual historian, and I'm going to try not to sound like Rick Perry here in his debate with Rand Paul. That's 5. Social history. And social history, there's 6. So those 6 different types of history I think can be applied really well to media. And media has definitely gotten cultural diversity down. But what about social diversity, economic diversity, political diversity? Those are different types of diversity that maybe aren't as discussed about or thought about, really done in media companies. So my main point I want to make is that while media companies are diverse in their background and their makeup, they still don't have a lot of diversity of thought. Now, why is this? Well, it's the same reason that sometimes police forces aren't very diverse. It can be kind of self-selecting. You know, who goes into the police? Who goes into media? This can be particularly damning when it comes to like social background and economic background. Right, so even if you have an Asian, a Native American, and a white person that are all journalists, chances are they've all had roughly the same, shall we say, social background and economic background. They probably went to a pretty good public school, private school. They probably went to a pretty good large public university like a state school or a small private liberal arts school. They studied journalism. They had parents that cared about them, loved them, backed their career choices, and they went into journalism. So when you have something like that, you kind of have, even though they're diverse, they generally still think the same way. And that applies to like economic background too. You know, even if you have an Asian, a black person, a white person, while they may be, you know, different ethnically and culturally, economically, chances are they all probably came from the same economic stratosphere, that kind of middle, upper middle class background, just by nature of the career choice and what it takes to generally go through universities and get a job in college with internships and move to New York City or Los Angeles or another big city. So, despite it being diverse on the surface, there's still big, economic and political and social diversity issues. And that if media companies, I think, wanted to broaden their appeal, they need to do more than just, you know, culturally diversify, but diversify thought. I'll speak from my experience, that a lot of media companies do not have a very diversification of thought. There's a lot of hive mind mentality, and I think most average people outside of the coast, California and the kind of mid-Atlantic coast, pick up on the fact that there's not a lot of diversity of thought. This also, I think, explains why the coast was so shocked when Donald Trump won the election, and people in Ohio weren't that shocked. There's more arguably more diversity of thought in the Midwest than there is in small urban centers, specifically like journalism. So when it comes to creating a more diverse journalism culture, and I mean like capital C culture, like the workforce itself, not only does an emphasis need to be placed on like different backgrounds of culture, but different social backgrounds and different economic backgrounds and different philosophical backgrounds that may, I think, pivot any newsroom to more adequately understand the people they're covering, the story selections that they have, and the angles at which they approach things. Once again, I'll speak from my own experience that there seems to be, specifically in like economic backgrounds, there's very little diversity. One, in the economic background that they come from, but two, the way they think about economics, like their ideology around or philosophy around economics. Most journalists are generally pro-union. They're generally slightly, socialism's a dirty word, but, socialistic in nature and a little bit anti-capitalist. I'm not talking big anti-capitalist, I'm talking, capital red communism. But, let's say there's more Bernie Sanders supporters in media than there are Rand Paul supporters in media. That's not a good or bad thing, it's just an observation when it comes down to how they approach stories and their economic ideology about covering it. So, that's just a thought about diversity in news. I'll tell you one more story that I think encapsulates diversity in media. So, when I was working at a company one time, there was a team of about 7 or 8 people. And you had myself, there was 2 women, a black guy, a gay guy, a guy from Italy. And we were in a meeting, and in that meeting we were talking about stories. And another author or journalist had wrote an article on Twitter, or it was at least published on Twitter, that said, don't buy a house, it's a waste of money, you should rent. That was kind of the headline. I'm butchering the headline, but the premise was, don't buy a house, rent. It's a waste of your money to buy a house, you should rent. And everybody in my meeting, in that room, the black person, the women, the gay guy, myself, even my boss, they all laughed at that article. They all thought it was stupid. They thought, what? Why would you ever rent? Renting is such a waste of money. You should always buy a house. And that's what I mean when it comes to diversity of thought. And that even though these people were totally different culturally, they all thought the same way and had the same biases economically. They were too willing to dismiss this article. And the arguments that this article made, which is that a house is an asset with a promised ROI over 15 or 30 years, depending on your mortgage and the rise of that value's property. And whatever your ROI, your return is expected in 30 years from that house, if you bought it at $200,000 and you expect to sell it at $300,000, what if you rented and your rent was slightly less than your mortgage payment each month, and you took that extra money that you would have put into your mortgage payment and put it into a diversified index fund. And over that 30 years, if you had put in the excess money that you would have put into the mortgage instead into that index fund, over 30 years, you may make more money than you would having bought a house, holding it for 30 years, and then trying to sell it. That was the argument. But I think people were too biased economically to see that, and they dismissed this headline and this idea and this argument out of hand. So anyway, that's just a thought about diversity. I think it's important to keep in mind diversity of thought, and social diversity, and economic diversity, as well as cultural diversity when it comes to talking about diversity in media. Hope you have a good morning, you guys.